Okay, so today we're going to be talking about foreshadowing in books. And this has been a difficult Dear Authors to plan out because foreshadowing is one that I think you kind of have to break down a little bit more, and it's kind of hard to break down in the formatting that Dear Authors is. So I'm gonna mix it up a little bit. We're gonna do this one a little bit different, and you guys can tell me if you like this style better or if we want to go back to the normal Dear Authors style. So I'm going to feature less comments, I'm going to do a little bit more breaking things down myself, and I'm going to use specific book examples of where these have happened. There will be spoilers, but there will be spoiler warnings, and there will be text on screen of where you can skip to avoid spoilers of certain books. But I have intentionally tried to use only examples from very popular books to make this as accessible as it can be. So I'm going to summarize what the general consensus was in the beginning of the video instead of at the end this time. So the most repetitive comments, the things that people seem to say the most was hint it, don't over hint it. Basically, subtlety is key. A lot of commenters talked about if you're bashing us over the head with it, then we don't tend to like that. Make it so subtle that we don't see it until the reveal happens, but then it all connects and it all makes sense. Make it so subtle that the rereads are that much more satisfying, but make sure the hinting starts early on and not immediately before the reveal. And I just want to get that out there because that is something that I come across a lot with my critiques when I am working with authors on their manuscripts before they're ready to publish. One thing that comes up frequently is when there's, whether it's a twist or whether it's a plot device, whether it's something that's going to help the crew of people get to the next step, a lot of times we're given the information that we need about that twist, about that plot device, immediately before that thing is introduced. And this is so unsatisfying for the reader. If we're given the information immediately before the thing that we need comes into play, that's when it is a plot device. In order to avoid it being a plot device is by giving us that information, feeding it to us little by little early on when it doesn't feel relevant, make it mesh into the story, and then when the thing comes up, this feels natural in the world, this works, this fits here, instead of plot device. I just wanted to throw that in there because I think that that's really important and it's something that I see happen so often. So it needed to be said. Okay, now let's talk about foreshadowing. We're going to talk about 4 specific types of foreshadowing. Now, there are more than 4, but these are the 4 that are discussed most in the comments, and these are the 4 that I want to talk about here. The first one, I'm going to keep it brief because it's the one that I care about the least personally, and probably the easiest one to do well, so we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, and that's actually, I don't know the correct term for it. I'm calling it subversion. The worst kind of foreshadowing, when a character says something like, oh, X will never happen, or I've never been to a funeral, but it's obvious that will change. Best is when you don't actually realize it's foreshadowing because it's a seemingly normal line of dialogue or world building hidden in the text. Ron suspecting Lockhart being a fake in the Chamber of Secrets comes off as jealousy because Hermione has a crush on him, but it turns out that Ron was 100% right as Lockhart was making it all up. So this is where you foreshadow something and then it pays off later and you look back and you're like, hey, they were right all along, or hey, that was going to happen all along. This is the only time I'm going to use an example of not a super popular, well-known book, but I still think it's going to be fine. I'm going to use the example of Smoke and Shadow, which is one of the Avatar graphic novels. I have an Avatar graphic novel summary video coming soon for the next 2, but I just read this one, so it's fresh on my mind. This happens twice in this one. We have when Ursa is terrified that something will happen to her daughter and she's overprotective. That later pays off. And then we have when Ty Lee is super nervous that Azula is just waiting to get back at them for their betrayal to her earlier on. This later pays off. Simple moments, simple conversations, showing people's fears, showing people's weaknesses, and then later having that come around round circle. This is a really frequent form of foreshadowing and doesn't really need to be broken down. Basically, don't make it extremely obvious. Don't make it one of those where it's like, this would never happen. I would never. And then, It happens 3 pages later. Moving on to the more subtle ones. Actually, not subtle at all, because our next one is tell the reader. One way of foreshadowing that isn't used as commonly but is well recognized is just telling the reader what's going to happen. This is usually done through an omniscient narrator that's actually talking to the reader or talking to a specific character, and they're going to lay out, here's what's going to happen. People are gonna die. The purpose of this is to connect the reader to the narrator and connect the reader to the event that's coming. The event isn't about shock factor anymore. Now it's about how can we get to this point? And a lot of times this can even be used subtly so that the reader is told what's coming, but it's told in a way that can be interpreted multiple ways, and it can still be a surprise to the reader even though it was laid out in front of them. One of my favorite instances of foreshadowing was in the 5th season. I liked that the author told you, not just hinted, the reveal several times, but with direct references that were very easy to miss. It seemed to me that each one presented got a bit easier until right near the end it was made very obvious. When you catch the twist early, it's a reward for reading the book carefully. One really obvious example is going to be the book thief. This is not going to be a spoiler. Death is the narrator, and he's telling the readers from the first chapter that there will be a death at the end. The example that the commenter gave is the 5th season, and I loved the way this was done. In the 5th season, we're straight up told by the narrator what's going to happen, but it's done in very obscure, subtle ways so that we can tell we're being told something that we can figure out, but it takes reading carefully. It takes picking up on the hints to get there. I did get there early on, by the way, and it felt really, really good. But it was done so masterfully in this one that even if you do figure it out before you're actually told, the reveal is still so satisfying, so intricate, that it's still a great reveal, even if you saw it coming 50 or 100 pages before. It's rare to execute this as well as the 5th season did. One more example of this that I'm going to give of just straight up telling the reader, I'm going to use Mistborn as an example, and I won't do spoilers here either. The big reveal at the end of Mistborn, the big reveal of who did it at the end of book 2 is told to us in book 1. In book 1, we overhear a scene where we're straight up told who done it in book 2, but we're not going to notice it on our first read through because it's such a throwaway moment that our brains are very unlikely to retain that. And then into book 2, we're just going with the mystery. We're trying to figure out what's going on here, and then the big reveal happens. And I will say that it is woven in very well that when the reveal happens, it all connects. But on your reread of Mistborn, you see that scene where we're told what the reveal is of book 2, but we only catch it this time because we already know the answer. And that's really cool. I really like that. Next, we're going to talk about hinting at the reveal over and over and over again. The best type of foreshadowing is when the author doesn't make a big deal out of it, and they just make sure that it reads so natural that you wouldn't pay it any mind. But then the event returns, and you go to return to the foreshadowing, and you're like, oh my goodness, how did I miss this? I'm going to give 2 examples here, and I'm going to give a good example and a bad example, one of which will be spoiler-free, one will unfortunately have spoilers. Spoiler-free, a book that I recently read that didn't do this great is Mexican Gothic. Now, don't get me wrong, I still highly recommend this book. I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed this book. However, the big reveal, why is this house haunted? What is going on in this home? The thing that we're here to find out is hinted at over and over and over again, and it's not done in the most subtle way to the point that a lot of people figured it out either in part or in as far as they possibly could have long before we get to the reveal. I was also one of those people. I don't mind figuring out what the reveal is before it comes. That just means to me that the author's done a good job of laying groundwork and they're not hiding things from the reader for the sake of shock factor. Don't do that, by the way. We need the clues. Authors that completely keep the reader in the dark intentionally so that they can't figure out the reveal, that's frustrating. The clues have to be there. So to me, if I figure it out, if I get there before the protagonist does, I'm fine with that because that just means good, the author laid the groundwork. However, if the author lays the groundwork so heavy-handed that it's not uncommon for the readers to figure it out a long time before the main character does, it can be unfortunate. Mexican Gothic is one that after I finished it, I read a lot of reviews and I did see that that was a regular complaint, that a lot of people figured out the reveal, or at least figured it out as far as they possibly could have, long before the protagonist did, long before the reveal finally came. And a lot of people were frustrated because they then interpreted the protagonist as, catch up, you're acting dumb, which I don't think this protagonist was dumb at all. I think that the foreshadowing was just too heavy. An example of it done well, I'm going to use Mistborn as an example. This will have spoilers. In Mistborn, the big reveal, you better skip forward if you don't want to know, the big reveal with Vin's earring is hinted at over and over again. We're given all the information we need. We're given all the information about how this earring could affect her, and Sanderson regularly talks about her earring. He talks about it in casual ways. He talks about it as part of her backstory. He doesn't just randomly bring it up. It's always intentional, and it always feels natural, but it is constantly brought up to us. And the information we need to be able to connect how the earring is affecting her is presented to us so we can get there on our own, to the point that a lot of readers miss it, don't see it until it happens. I was one of those readers, and quite a few readers see it, put them together, and are able to get there before Vin does. My husband was one of those readers. But it's done in a way that if you figure it out, it's still satisfying, or at least I think so, because it's done in a way where the information is presented to you and you can put it together if you can, but if you aren't able to, that's fine. All the information was there. You see how it works. Just telling the reader over and over again, really blatant, here are the clues, put them together, dummy, this doesn't work. Giving it to us in a subtle way that feels cohesive and makes sense, but you can notice, this is being brought up a little bit too often. Maybe there's something here. That is done well. I've given you two examples so you can read both examples if you need more information. And last, we're going to talk about very, very, very subtle foreshadowing, not hinting over and over again, just a few things here and there, but it's odd enough that it sticks out to the reader. I love when foreshadowing is simple enough to not be noticeable until a reread. It's so special when you can discover new things about your favorite novel upon reread. Now, I read off that comment, but this doesn't have to only be seen on reread, but rather it's something that you probably wouldn't be able to put together because the foreshadowing is so subtle that on your first read through, you almost certainly wouldn't be able to get there, but once you get to the reveal, it's like, oh, okay, I see the pieces now. The last one we talked about, you can put it together. This one, you probably can't, but then upon reread, you see that there were a lot of hints for it. You can't have known until your second time through. I'm going to use a spoiler example again. This time I'm going to talk about Stormlight Archive, specifically Way of Kings and Words of Radiance. If you haven't read Oathbringer yet, you're safe. I'll also say that this isn't a huge, massive, giant spoiler, so if you don't mind some medium-sized spoilers, you'll be fine. But it is relevant enough that be wary. Here are the spoilers. Skip ahead if you don't want them. In Way of Kings, we're told in Chapter 7, memories attacked her, Nambalat bruised, his coat torn, a long, silvery sword in his hand, sharp enough to cut stones as if they were water. Then later in the same chapter, she raised her free hand to her head, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of House Devar's situation, her part in it, the secret she carried, hidden 10 heartbeats away. Then later on, in The Way of Kings, she screamed then, jumped to her feet on her bed, dropping the pad, breaking it against the wall. Before she could consciously think of what she was doing, she was struggling with her sleeve, trying to get the soulcaster out. It was the only thing she had resembling a weapon. No, that was stupid. She didn't know how to use it. She was helpless. Except, storms, she thought, frantic. I can't use that. I promised myself. She began the process anyway. 10 heartbeats to bring forth the fruit of her sin. She proceeds of her most horrific act. Shallan has a shard blade, and there were hints in the first book, but they were so subtle. Now see, what I really love about this is, especially in that last scene that I read, that scene when you're first reading it feels weird. What is she talking about? As you're reading that scene, you're thinking, I don't have as much information as she does. What is she talking about? And for me, at least, when I was reading that scene, I took note of it. I annotate my books. I underlined it. I said, remember this scene, and I dog-eared the page. I'm sorry to all of you people who hate annotations and dog ears. But that scene, while it fit well in what was happening, it was clear to me, the reader, something is weird here, I should remember this. So it stuck out in my mind, and it was a scene that I remembered. Then as I read on, there were a few other scenes like that that just didn't fit right. It made sense to me. The hints were there, the things that I had taken note on, that I had dog-eared, that I had looked back on, I was able to look back on later. It made sense to me. I don't need a reread for it to make sense. I see it because there are these really abstract, weird things that don't work, but I can't get there on my own on the first read through. And then on reread, when I know I'm reading through again, it's all there. It's all there. And it's subtle enough that it's not fully satisfying until the second read through, but it's also not so subtle that it's not satisfying the first read through. It's a really hard balance to strike, and Sanderson does a really good job of hitting that balance. Last thing I'm going to mention here is to have a variety. It's okay to use a lot of different types of foreshadowing. It's okay to have more obvious foreshadowing that people can pick up on, that people can get there on their own. Not really obvious. You know, we don't want readers to be frustrated and perceive the protagonist as stupid because your foreshadowing is so heavy-handed. But obvious enough that the reader can get there, as well as subtle foreshadowing for later reveals. It's okay to use a lot of different types. In fact, it's encouraged. Foreshadowing, like most literary tools, works best when authors vary how it's used, especially in a long series. So give us some more obvious foreshadowing and some more subtle bits and pieces that we have to work for. Make some of them turn out as you would expect and give the others a twist. I enjoy it best when foreshadowing is so well done that even when you're sure that you know what it means, you're not really sure that's what's going on. So it can still keep you guessing. And even obvious foreshadowing, you wonder if and how you're letting your assumptions mislead you. So there you go, there is a breakdown of some of the things that were discussed in this community tab. You can also read through the tab. The majority of comments are just saying, please keep it subtle. People really like a payoff where it's clear that the author was intentional, where it's clear that there were hints all throughout, and once you get to the reveal, all of those things kind of come together in the reader's mind, and we see how intentional this author was. Having things kind of rushed together, thrown together at the end, there's no hinting, there's no foreshadowing until right before we need it, vastly unsatisfying. But also, keep it subtle because you don't want your protagonist to be perceived as stupid. I'm gonna end this video with giving more examples of books and authors that do a phenomenal job at foreshadowing their series. I didn't want to give a lot of examples throughout this video because I wanted to keep it as spoiler-free as possible, but now I have a ton of books to read. If you love foreshadowing, if you want to see it done, I have lots of examples of authors that are amazing at foreshadowing. The first book I'm gonna mention is The Lies of Locke Lamora, Scott Lynch. I had to include it, but I didn't use it as an example because some of you people have started making a drinking game out of how often I mention this book, and I care about your health. But it's great in The Lies of Locke Lamora. Brandon Sanderson, in general, is phenomenal at this in pretty much everything he writes. Pretty much everything. Neil Gaiman is phenomenal in every book I've read by him at foreshadowing. He's one of the most intentional authors I've ever read, and I love him for it. Patrick Rothfuss in The Name of Wind, his foreshadowing is fantastic. The Lord of the Rings does a great job, and of course, the 5th season is one of the best I've ever seen done. There you go. That's Dear Authors foreshadowing. Let me know if you liked this sort of structure, or if you want to go back to the other way. I'm good either way. I post videos every Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.